Thanks so much, Peter. And yes, I'm back. Thanks so much for Bhakti for the very clear overview of, fisheries trade. And now we're going to talk about the other side of that, which is the illicit trade, which is going on, which is, of course, undermining, our ability to have sustainable fisheries. So, illicit trade, when it comes to fisheries, is specifically defined as trade involving money, goods, or value gained from illegal and unreported fishing by vessels catching fish for commercial purposes. You see that unregulated fishing is not there. So if we're talking about the IUU, we're only talking about the illegal and the unreported here because, as I've mentioned before, unregulated fishing, as we know, means that, this has not necessarily been regulated by governments, by RFMOs. So it's not necessarily breaking the law if you engage in unregulated fishing. And so this is why this is dealing only specifically with illegal and unreported fishing. Of course, this is by commercial, vessels catching for commercial purposes, because we're talking about trade. And illicit trade happens in a variety of ways, but some of the most common ways include at-sea transshipment, which is pretty poorly regulated compared to, for example, port state control. Also, export in large refrigerated containers, because a lot of the time when we're doing port inspections and so on, at-sea inspections, we are inspecting fishing vessels rather than these refrigerated containers. So it's just a bit easier, actually, to transport illicit fish in these containers. And then in cases where it's very difficult to access the international market, because, for example, there's catch documentation schemes or other types of traceability mechanisms, sometimes the way to, funnel illicit fish into the supply chain is actually just by selling it to local and regional markets that might not be as regulated. And also potentially international markets which don't have all of these strict regulations on things like traceability. And this is not a small problem. Up to 14 million metric tons of unreported fish catches have been estimated to be traded illicitly each year, with an economic impact of between 26 and 50 billion US dollars annually. Unfortunately, most of that being lost from the African and Asian regions. So definitely not a small problem we have to deal with. And the negative effects of this are the same as, if we think about IUU. We have depletion of fish stocks, diversion of funds from the legitimate economy, taxes, license fees, all that kind of stuff is obviously not being paid. And also that obviously leads to things like food insecurity, loss of jobs and income. So how are we preventing this? Obviously, we want to try and prevent IUU fishing at its source. But when we're not able to do that, there are other measures, countries have begun to implement along the supply chain, which are trying to prevent this illicit fish trade. Market measures. So some of these include things like port state measures, which, as Bhakti mentioned, prevent illegally caught fish entering into supply chains through the port. Trade sanctions, many of you will be very familiar with these in the terms of the EU yellow cards, for example. We also want to think about banning harmful fisheries subsidies. Fisheries support can come at many different points in the supply chain. Of course, this can include fishing inputs like fuel and so on, which, if we take away those harmful subsidies, can prevent IUU fishing at its source, but there's also all sorts of support that can happen along the supply chain as well. And then we have traceability mechanisms, such as eco-labeling, which is of course done by private or companies or NGOs. This works on market laws of supply and demand. So if consumers want sustainable fish, then these companies will essentially supply it. And then we have catch documentation schemes, which are implemented by government entities or intergovernmental entities like RFMOs. And these, of course, are trying to trace the fish throughout the supply chain. So we say that we try and trace the fish from the catch to the plate. Now, I'm going to go over most of these in the presentation in a little bit more detail, but it is a lot to cover, so we're not going to be able to go too in depth on these issues, but I'm just going to give a sort of introduction. And then if you have any particular questions on it, we can obviously discuss it more in the panel. But what I will also do is I'll pause after each section, just in case anyone has any questions or clarifications, just to make sure that I'm explaining it properly. Okay, so I'm not really going to talk about port state measures because we've already discussed it quite a lot. I'm going to actually go straight on to trade sanctions. So trade sanctions are essentially bans on trade of fish with a country that's failing to either control IUU fishing in its waters or its fleets, or allowing unsustainable fishing in its waters. And these trade sanctions are used to protect particular markets from unsustainably caught fish. And like I said, this is something like the EU yellow and red carding scheme, which many of you know about. However, these types of trade sanctions are generally only effective if they are applied by large and powerful importers. Obviously, we saw in Bhakti's presentation who those importers are. US, EU, China, Japan, etc. Anyone think about why that is? Why is it that these trade sanctions might only work if they are applied by these powerful importers? Any ideas? As opposed to being applied by a country which doesn't import a lot of fish? If I impose a ban on you, we are we are trading fish and I'm buying all your fish, and I impose a ban on you because I think you're not engaging in IUU. I think you are engaging in IUU. And you're exporting, say, 50% of your fish to me. That's going to be a problem, right? Because that's a lot of money for you. What if you impose the ban on me? I'm not importing anything from, you're not importing anything from me. What if you want to impose the ban on me? Do you think it will work? Do you think that I'll care? I'm not setting you anything. I'm not going to lose anything if you ban my fish trade, right? You see the difference. You see why, in certain cases, this will work as a measure to address IUU and unsustainable fishing, and in other cases, it's not going to work. Yeah? It's all about economics. Who has the money? Who's paying who? Okay, so let's talk about the EU carding scheme. I have a couple of examples of trade bans. This is the first one. This is the one which I think you all know the most about. Essentially, this comes from the EU's IUU regulation. It uses trade measures as a tool to force third-party countries to deal with IUU fishing in their waters or their locally flagged fleets. So, of course, the way this works, the EU assesses what you're doing, decides that you're not adequately controlling IUU fishing, and gives you a yellow card. The yellow card is just a warning. It doesn't actually have any trade implications. It just says you need to sort out your fisheries, otherwise we will ban trade with you. And then if you don't do that, then they might upgrade it to a red card, and then you're not allowed to export any of your fish to the EU anymore. So that's the basics of how this works. And whenever I'm talking about all these things, I like to interrogate whether they're actually working or not. In the case of the carding scheme, we have some successes. I'm just limiting this to this particular region. We have some successes. Korea is one of them. Philippines, Thailand, we also saw, have massively, completely changed their systems. We saw that on Friday. And they had their cards lifted. There's also been some failures. Unfortunately, we don't have any of our colleagues from Cambodia here, but Cambodia has been red listed for nearly a decade. And part of the reason why in some cases this is successful and some cases this is not successful is that it really depends on whether you actually have the resources to comply at the end of the day. Part of the problem is that the EU can assist with things like legal reform, and it does, but not with capacity constraints in the long run. So if you have a country that just doesn't necessarily have the capacity to properly control this problem, then they may not be able to comply or comply effectively. Now, obviously, as a country, you can make certain decisions, which, makes it much harder for you to comply. For example, flagging vessels that are fishing on the high seas when you don't have the capacity to exercise proper control over those vessels. That would be a decision that you take, which would increase your, decrease your ability to comply, to actually control IUU fishing. Same as if you're going to let a whole lot of distant water vessels into your waters, but you don't have the capacity to actually control and monitor them. So you can make decisions as a country, which of course can, put you in this situation. So it's not all on the fact that you don't necessarily have the capacity or the resources, but this is certainly a factor. The other element of this program, which I do have some issues with, is the way it's applied. So I'm not downplaying its success. I think there have been very successful instances where this program has really done a lot of good. But I also feel that this program is applied very selectively to countries that cannot or will not reciprocate, or countries which the EU doesn't have a lot of reciprocal trade with. For example, this is the map of the IUU cards, right? So we can see all the countries that have had cards. The yellow ones currently have a card, the green ones have had the cards lifted, and the red ones have had their cards upgraded, of course, to a red card or a complete trade ban. Any countries you think are missing from that map that you think should, are notorious for IUU fishing and perhaps should have had a yellow card, but don't? Any thoughts? Sorry? What about China? We know China's distant water fleet is quite notorious for IUU fishing, but they've never been given a card. There's a lot of reciprocal trade flow with China, between China and the EU, right? Also, they're pretty powerful. What about India? This is Sri Lanka, by the way. What about India? What about all the BRICS countries? Russia, Brazil, South Africa. None of them have had yellow cards either, even though we do see instances of IUU fishing in these countries. So just something that I always like to just draw attention to is the fact that, I don't think this program is applied entirely fairly. And this has legal implications. And this is illustrated by the next example that I have, potential legal implications of not applying the program fairly. And that is the US shrimp turtle case. Has anyone heard of this case? It's a World Trade Organization case. It's quite old, it's from 1998. But some of your countries were involved, Thailand and Malaysia. Yeah, you've heard of it? Yeah. So basically in this case, the United States decided that they were going to pass a regulation which essentially essentially said that anyone who wants to export shrimp to the United States market needs to put a turtle excluder device into the shrimp nets. Does everyone know what a turtle excluder device is? Does anyone not know? This is what it is. So essentially how it works is that you put a grid in your shrimp net. The shrimp can pass through it, but if there's a turtle, it kind of bumps up against this grid and there's an escape hatch and it can escape. So basically what this means is that it reduces turtle bycatch. It's a simple way to reduce turtle bycatch, and the United States wanted everybody, all countries that were exporting shrimp, to put these into their nets. The problem with the way that the US went about this is that they decided that they were going to help certain countries to comply, Caribbean countries specifically. They talk to them, they put in measures to help them comply with this regulation. But they didn't do this for all countries. They didn't do this for the Asian countries. So India, Pakistan, Thailand, and Malaysia complained to the World Trade Organization. They said that the US was not treating all countries equally under the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. And even though there was an exception in this agreement, that you could put in trade measures to conserve exhaustible natural resources, which turtles were found to be, again, it was found that they weren't even applying this exception fairly because they had helped some countries and not others. So when you don't apply regulations fairly, what happens is that often, if you get taken to the World Trade Organization's appellate body, which is the court, as in this case, you may be found in violation of those international rules. So in this case, the US was found in violation because of the way they'd applied this. And subsequently, they did change their regulation, and then there was a subsequent case, and then they were allowed to implement the ban, but it was in a changed form. So this is potentially the result of, not actually applying your trade bans fairly. So this is another example of a specific type of trade ban for a very specific type of fish. The EU one is obviously much broader. It's a complete trade ban on all fisheries, all fish stocks from a particular country. The this isn't the first time the US has been involved in this type of litigation, by the way. They also have a big fight with Mexico over dolphin-safe tuna. So, they've been involved in quite a few of these cases regarding regulations on bycatch. Okay, so that was just an overview of trade bans. Does anyone have any quick questions or need any clarification before I move on to traceability? Everybody very clear on trade bans? Yeah? Okay. I know many of you have had to deal with them, so I'm sure you have a good understanding. All right, so then let's move on to traceability. I'm not going to talk too much about eco-labeling, but like I said, essentially eco-labeling is working on market laws of supply and demand, but I'm going to talk a lot more about catch documentation schemes, but obviously if you have any questions on eco-labeling, you can ask them during the panel. So again, I think this is something that a lot of you are dealing with in your countries, these catch documentation schemes. And what they are intended to do, as I said, is to track fish from the fishing grounds to markets, or from catch to plate. This is how they're meant to work. They're meant to essentially fence off the legal fish from the illegal fish and funnel it to the market. And, they require essentially when the fish is caught that a catch certificate is created, and then that catch certificate will accompany that fish throughout the supply chain. And, it will be verified at various points in the supply chain that the fish that's recorded on the catch certificate is the same fish that's, being imported or exported or processed or whatever it might be. This is just a visual representation of how it works. I like this little picture because I think it illustrates an important point, which we did talk about last week. And that's the fact that a catch documentation scheme, so this yellow line represents the catch documentation scheme, and this dotted orange line represents the actual path that the fish is taking. The thing with catch documentation schemes is that often what they are requiring in terms of documentation and the various nodes that they require you to document are usually just catch, landing, export, and import. So as it moves in and out of countries, you generally only have to verify it at the export and import stage. But in reality, the fish is not just going straight from landing to export in many cases. Often it's being stored or processed, as in this case. And, I think, as I said, this illustrates something important, that apart from actually complying with the various documentation requirements of a catch documentation scheme as a country, You also need to have a robust traceability system within your own country, a national traceability system, to ensure you always know when the fish is moving through your country exactly where it is. So even though the catch documentation scheme is only asking you to verify at export, you also need to know what's happening at processing, at the processing stage in this case. Because when you do verify at export that, you know, the catch certificate matches the fish, then you have to be able to know what happened at the processing stage, because you have to be able to verify that it's the same fish. You have to verify that at the processing stage, it wasn't supplemented by this little red fish. Yeah. So that's kind of an additional aspect which, you know, may not seem apparent at first when you are agreeing to comply with these catch documentation schemes, but something to remember that this does obviously create more of a burden on countries. Something that Andreas raised last week is that it's pretty expensive to comply with these catch documentation schemes, and sometimes for certain fisheries it's just not really worth it, particularly small scale fisheries, which is of course a problem. There's also different types of catch documentation schemes, and this is again where we get into the analysis of whether these actually work or not to prevent IEU fishing. Now, the catch documentation schemes that you are probably mostly complying with are those ones that you have to comply with to export to the EU or the US, right? Most of you, that's what you're dealing with, right? The EU catch documentation scheme, or the US one. Yeah? So those are called market-based catch documentation schemes. And the thing with those catch documentation schemes is that they protect a particular market from IEU caught fish. So for example, you comply with the EU's catch documentation scheme, you're protecting the EU market from IEU caught fish. But in general, you're not necessarily decreasing the amount of IEU fish that's being traded globally. Because in fact, you know, if it's not going into the EU market, then often it's going somewhere else. So what these market-based catch documentation schemes actually do is they protect the market of, you know, the country that's applying them, but they don't necessarily reduce IEU fishing worldwide. The only catch documentation schemes that are actually able to do that are the ones created by RFMOs. The ones that either ensure traceability in international markets, or the most effective are the ones that ensure traceability in domestic and international markets. Because then, once a fish is caught, you know where it's going, anywhere in the world, in theory. You can trace it anywhere in the world. But because obviously, you know, this is a much more onerous process, this is only done for a few high-value species, like tuna. So in general, I think that, you know, catch documentation schemes have varying levels of efficacy when it comes to actually addressing IEU fishing, and the ones that really work the best to actually reduce IEU fishing globally are these fishery-based catch documentation schemes. And as Bhakti mentioned, of course, we have the voluntary guidelines for catch documentation schemes, and also this accompanying technical guidelines, which help national authorities to understand and implement catch documentation schemes. And if you haven't read these and you're working with catch documentation schemes, I would really encourage you to do so, because these have a lot of information on how to apply it, sort of best principles, and how to understand the catch documentation schemes. Any comments, questions, issues with CDSs? Everybody clear on what these are, how they work? Okay, I'm going to take that as a yes. All right, so finally, we're going to move on to harmful fishery subsidies. Now, I want to start out by defining a subsidy. You know, I like to define things. So, and the reason why I think this is important is that many people, I think, see subsidies or fishery subsidies as a much narrower category than they actually are. Fishery subsidies can actually encompass a huge range of support and what we actually might consider a fishery subsidy legally. So, when we think of the four elements of a subsidy, at least as defined by the WTO, first, to be a subsidy, there has to be a financial contribution. It doesn't necessarily have to be a direct payment. It can come in many other forms. It can be a loan, it can be a tax break, it can be some other type of indirect payment. But there has to be some sort of financial contribution, and it has to be made by a government or a public body. So, for example, there's an NGO which wants to come and provide support to your fishing industry, replace all the old fishing vessels, and they work directly with the industry. That's not a subsidy. The only time it's a subsidy is if they pay that money directly to the government will then implement the program. But if there's an NGO or whoever working directly with your fishing industry, that isn't actually considered a fisheries subsidy for the purposes of international law, which is important when it comes to the fisheries subsidies agreement. There has to be a benefit conferred, which basically just means the subsidy has to have some sort of value on a market somewhere. And also it has to be specific to an industry or region, and in this case, of course, we are talking about the fisheries industry. Is that clear to everyone? Okay, so under that pretty wide definition, here are some examples of fisheries subsidies. We have the ones that you probably are most aware of, the fishing inputs, fuel, ice, etc. There's also the vessel construction, modernization of vessels. Anything there which anyone finds surprising that they maybe didn't think could fall under the definition of a fisheries subsidy? You don't have to put up your hand. You can just shout it out if you see anything which you think, maybe I didn't think that was fisheries subsidy. Any thoughts? No right or wrong answers. This is just your own opinion, knowledge. Yeah? Everybody, yeah? Improvement to safety, yes. That is a big one, actually. Something which, as we'll come to in a minute, is pretty contentious because in some ways, if you are, if you're giving a life jacket or whatever it might be, that's one thing. But if you are modernizing a vessel for the purposes of improving safety, that could potentially fall under this, right? And this one, as we'll see in a minute, is often seen as a harmful capacity-enhancing subsidy. So improvements to safety is an interesting one that, I personally think there needs to be a specific exemption for when we are talking a little bit later about the fishery subsidies agreement. So yeah, so thank you very much for that one. Anyone else? Yes. Francis.
So in the case that a government receives fees for licenses and levies for whatever taxes on the fishing industry, and those fees and levies are used then to plow back into the fishing industry, is that considered a subsidy?
Yes, yeah, it's a very good example, but yeah, for sure. As long as it's government support, it falls under that definition. So yeah, I think this is when we definitely get into the more complicated aspects of this.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, what about fisheries management? Anyone, think, it's not all, but some parts of fisheries management, you giving a payment or some sort of benefit to the fishing industry can be seen as fishery subsidies. Yeah, so there's various ones there, which people find a bit surprising sometimes. Vessel decommissioning is another one. Vessel decommissioning, obviously, again, can be seen as a fisheries management measure in some cases, unless you're trying to modernize the fishery by, buying back all the old boats so the fishers can buy new ones. But in many cases, when we decommission vessels, it's often to decrease capacity in the fishing industry. And in that case, if you are paying the fishers to retire the boats and retire the licenses, that can also be seen as a fisheries subsidy. Okay, so we have many, many different types of support which can fall under the definition of a fisheries subsidy. So, as we saw, some of it can be beneficial to sustainability, some of it is not beneficial to sustainability, and so there has been an attempt to classify these different types of subsidies into 3 categories. This is an academic exercise actually done by economists. And under this, good subsidies, beneficial subsidies, are things like fisheries management, stock assessment, etc. Bad subsidies are capacity enhancing subsidies for modernization, fishing inputs, infrastructure, etc. And then we have this weird category of ambiguous subsidies where, whether they are capacity enhancing or whether they are beneficial really depends on how they're structured. Again, if we look at vessel buybacks, as I said, there's different ways that you can approach this. In some ways, you could be trying to remove capacity from the fishing industry, in which case it would be beneficial. In other instances, you could be trying to modernize the fishing industry, in which case it might be seen as capacity enhancing. One of the problems with this classification is that it's a little bit too simplistic. And again, I want to go back to the point raised by the gentleman regarding safety. As I said, safety can potentially be seen as a capacity enhancing subsidy, which is why it has question mark there, if we are, for example, modernizing a vessel to make it safer. So essentially, what this classification is doing is that it's only looking at these concepts of good and bad and so on from a sustainability of the fish stocks perspective, so an environmental sustainability perspective, not so much a social sustainability perspective. And this leads to these problems that we see with sometimes subsidies which actually are very socially advantageous, such as safety at sea, being lumped into this category of, bad subsidies because they are seen as not environmentally sustainable. And even if we look at these capacity enhancing subsidies, in some cases, they can be seen as beneficial for social sustainability, of course. And so ultimately, we need to be thinking about trying to find a balance between the sort of social and the environmental when it comes to subsidies, which is not always sort of inherent in this very simplistic classification. But unfortunately, this classification has been the one which has very much been adopted when we are looking at international agreements like the WTO agreement. So again, just to put this in perspective, how much fishery support is actually being given worldwide. Estimates of fishery subsidies put these at approximately $35 billion annually. So huge amounts of money going in to support the fishing industry. And at the moment, most of those are capacity enhancing, with 22% of world subsidies being spent on fuel. And this is often for distant water fleets who are fishing in the high seas, fishing in the waters of other countries, because of course they have to go very long distances and would not be at all profitable if they didn't at least have their fuel subsidized as well as other costs. This is just showing, the different subsidy levels by region and also by type. So I don't know if you can see that, but, Asia, here we can see is giving the most subsidies. Obviously you have the biggest fisheries production, makes sense. This is not actually including China. China has its own little graph here because it gives by far and away the world's largest number of fishery subsidies. This is followed by Europe, North America, And then at the bottom here, we have Africa, South Central America, and the Caribbean, and also Oceania. This dark line represents the capacity enhancing subsidies. This light one is the beneficial, the fisheries management, and so on. And this is the ambiguous. And what we see here is a pretty unequal global distribution, right? So these fishes up here are getting their costs subsidized, are getting maybe the latest vessels and equipment, whereas these ones down here are not getting all of those. And that leads, of course, to a lot of unfair competition on global markets. These fishers can sell their fish at a much lower price, for example, than these ones. And also, they can probably catch a lot more fish because they have better equipment and better boats than the fishers down here. We also see this distribution when it comes to the industrial versus the small scale. So you can see here the large scale sector is getting huge number of subsidies compared to the small scale sector. There's, again, a lot of unfairness, a lot of unequal distribution here. But in both cases, you can see the majority of subsidies being given are capacity enhancing subsidies. Now, this is not to say that we should increase the subsidies being given to the small scale sector. That's not what I'm advocating for, at least not the capacity enhancing ones. But instead, we should be thinking about how to reduce the subsidies being given to the large scale sector. Because ultimately, subsidies have a lot of, or at least harmful fisheries subsidies, have a lot of negative consequences, a lot of problems, including leading to overfishing and overcapacity. We are continually essentially subsidizing the costs of an industry which is increasingly becoming unprofitable in many cases because of the depletion of fish stocks, which means those boats continue to go out and fish despite the fact that the stocks continue to deplete. So capacity enhancing subsidies can very easily lead to overfishing. They can also lead to IUU fishing for a number of reasons. Again, as they lead to stock depletion, of course, there's a lot more incentive to engage in IUU fishing, and in some cases as well, countries have continued to subsidize vessels that have actually been caught IUU fishing and listed as IUU fishing vessels. And also the fact that without subsidies, distant water fishing fleets would pretty much about 70% of them be unprofitable. And these fleets are also pretty notorious for engaging in overfishing and IUU fishing around the world. They also create unfair competition, as we saw, between regions, between the small and large scale sector. They distort markets, because again, you're having all your costs subsidized. What does a fish actually cost? We don't know. We're having all the costs subsidized, so we can sell them at a much lower price, and we don't actually know what the cost of fish is because of all these subsidies. They're very difficult to undo. I'm sure you all work in government. You understand that once you've started to give money to people and you come along and you say, I'm going to take away your money, they're not going to be very happy. No politician wants to deal with that. And ultimately, because of all of this, they affect food security and livelihoods. We see significant depletion of stocks in places where there are a lot of distant water fisheries. So that brings me to the WTO Fisheries Subsidies Agreement. Now, this agreement, they started negotiating in 2001. They only agreed in 2022 to pass an agreement which was only half an agreement, so it took a very long time. But, at least they came up with something. It came into force on the 15th of September 2025. The negotiations are not yet completed, however, so we have this agreement, but they're still negotiating on one particular aspect which they want to add to it. And we'll see if that actually leads to anything. And as Bhakti mentioned, this is what is included in the fishery subsidies agreements. So bans on subsidies that contribute to IUU fishing, bans on subsidies for vessels targeting overfished stocks, and also bans on subsidies for fishing in unregulated high seas areas. And there are several additional provisions, and I think the most important one for most of you is this one, that there's a 2-year exemption for developing countries from complying with these first 2 bans over here. And there's also technical assistance for developing countries and so on. Then we have these ongoing negotiations, which seek to go a little bit further than the current agreement. They seek to ban specific types of subsidies, like, for example, a fuel subsidy. So, under the current agreement, if you want to provide a fuel subsidy to your fishing vessel, you only have to make sure that that vessel is not engaging in IUU fishing, which means it's not on an IUU list. It's not fishing overfished stocks, and there's an additional part of that which says that if you put in management measures to, address the problem of, overfishing, then you can continue to provide subsidies for that. So there's a little bit of an exemption there. And then thirdly, you just need to make sure that your vessel is not fishing in an unregulated high seas area. Under these additional negotiations, I mean, the intention is that you wouldn't be able to give any fuel subsidies no matter what. You know, it's not contingent on anything, it's just you won't be able to give it at all. Now, I don't think that this will ultimately be what happens, because countries will probably not accept that. But, there's going to be a lot of exemptions either way, particularly for developing countries, and also for small-scale fisheries. Again, we have no exemptions for safety. It's very frustrating that these kind of social elements are not taken into account. But at least there are some exemptions, for example, for small-scale fishing and certain developing countries. This one, however, as you may have noticed, only provides a 2-year exemption for developing countries. It does not provide anything for small-scale fisheries. And I imagine for many of you this is a concern, because a lot of the time, the stocks that are being targeted by small-scale fisheries are overfished. There might be IUU fishing going on. There might be other issues. And so I can imagine that when it comes to implementing this agreement, for those of you who have actually ratified it, I can see that this would be something of a concern because, within 2 years, by 2027, September 2027, either you need to make sure that your fisheries are not, contributing to IUU fishing or, targeting overfished stocks, or you have to withdraw these subsidies, right? So I just kind of want to end off by saying that, of course we can talk about this more in the panel discussion, but, my 2 cents on this transition is that, of course, over the next 2 years, you want to be addressing some of these issues in your countries, for example, putting in management measures to rebuild overfished stocks. But also, I think particularly when it comes to small-scale fisheries, there is a need to maybe start to think about moving from these types of subsidies which are really just designed to increase fishing capacity and production, like fuel subsidies, like vessel modernization and so on, to more socially responsible subsidies where you can, both protect the environment and the social elements. Some things, that we talked about last week, for example, improving diversification of livelihoods, potentially, providing these systems where you provide social security in exchange for compliance, and various other methods, potentially working to valorize catches, to improve processing, all of these elements which can increase the value of fish without actually increasing the fishing effort. Of course, being careful to make sure that this doesn't increase capacity in the fishing industry. So I have included a slide here that you can look at later. I don't think it's actually, oh, there we go. Okay, I included it. I thought I hit it. So these are just some of the potential ways in which we can start to move from harmful capacity enhancing subsidies to subsidies which are more responsible in terms of both environmental and social sustainability, although ultimately there's no one-size-fits-all approach, and we do need to consider the environmental and social effects of these subsidies. I think this is a way that we can start to think about transitioning as a way to comply with this agreement for those who have ratified it or are still planning to ratify it. So, that's the end of my presentation. Thank you so much for your attention.